Hi, thanks for joining me on HR Chalk Talk. I'm Brent Houchin, founder of Houchin Consulting and co-founder of Tech People Resources, also known as TPR. The HR Chalk Talk podcast is here to provide information to those in HR, those in leadership positions, and those who simply want to know more about HR best practices. Today's subject is unconscious bias. But let's start with the difference between unconscious bias and implicit bias. They do have slightly different meanings. Unconscious bias refers to bias that we are unaware of and which happens outside of our control. Implicit bias refers to the same area but questions the level to which these biases are unconscious, especially as we are being made increasingly aware of them. I will do another podcast sometime soon on implicit bias. Today, we're going to jump in on unconscious bias. Why do we need to understand unconscious bias? Well, unconscious bias can affect workplace and organizations. It can introduce unintentional discrimination and result in poor decision-making. It has been shown that such biases can have an impact on recruitment, mentoring, and promotions. Being in HR for the amount of years that I have been, I have seen this happen over and over and over. Do we all have unconscious bias? Yep, every single one of us. The point is, it's unconscious, and in most cases, we do not realize we have this until we dig in a bit deeper and understand. When we hear the term unconscious bias, we start summoning ideas of what we think it means or how to define it. I was on a call recently where a client stated, and quite definitively, that unconscious bias is preferring candidates with certain names, the similarity bias, and let me back up to what these mean. Preferring candidates with certain names, meaning that you could hear a name that denounces to you or tells you what their background must be, where they're from. It may sound like a German last name. It may sound like a Jewish last name. It could sound like a Swedish last name. And we could have a bias against those particular places. And we need to know that we have those, and we need to be able to work on stopping that bias. That when we hear or see a name, that it immediately tells us, or we think it tells us, where they're from or what their culture may be. The similarity bias. So looking for people who are like you, who are like me. And I think all of us do this to a certain degree, but isn't it so much better when we bring people in who are different than us? Therefore, we get and gain something new and different from one another. There's also the gender bias. There are many people who will state that, men can do better than this at this sort of work. Women are better at this sort of work. People start immediately going down the gender bias trail that is dangerous, scary, and can get you into a lot of trouble if you're articulating that. If you're realizing in your mind that this is where you're going, you need to stop it. There's also height bias. There are people who absolutely have bias against super tall people, against shorter people. That sort of thing absolutely exists. Weight bias. There are people who will see someone who, or that they assume is heavier than they are, and then they start biasing as to why they're that way. Are they just lazy and they don't want to go to the gym, or they're lazy and don't want to eat the right foods? Maybe they're a foodie and that's why they look the way that they do. People get these biases stuck inside, and they start actually acting on those when they are in the workplace. Location or geographic bias. There was an entire TV show based on 90210. That's a zip code. There is geographic bias. Where I live in Denver, there are many cities that surround us, and I will often hear people rag on a nearby city to me, or one that's not so near, but they have an immediate thought on why that place isn't good or why it's better There's also the opposite bias that, if you live there, you must be a better person. You must have more money. You must be more qualified based on where you live. And then there's appearance bias. Appearance bias is huge. People will look at someone and immediately determine, well, I think you can or can't do this for this very reason. I think you can or can't do this because of the way that you look. And that can bring us down to things like someone who is wheelchair bound. Or perhaps they're not bound to the wheelchair, but they're actually in it because of a recent surgery, and they're going to be up and walking again soon. We are creating biases, and we create thoughts in our minds that tell us that someone can or cannot do something based on these biases. And although I agree with them that they are biases, the ones that I just read to you, there are so many more, such as bias for or against those in the military. I hear that often. Well, if they're in the military, then they're going to have to come and go, and, well, we just need them to be here a lot more than that. Bias against hair color or eye color. I've heard so many times where people will say, well, they're blonde, so they must be dumb. I'm actually blonde. I don't consider myself dumb. Although my hair I don't have a whole lot of it left, but it's still blonde. And there are bias against those who have a disability and what they are capable of doing. These are just to name an additional few. So how do we recognize unconscious bias? Bypassing rational and logical thinking, we rapidly sort people into groups, thinking we're using these processes effectively and often calling them intuition. However, the categories we use to sort people are not actually logical, and perhaps they're not even legal. Our brains, without our permission, take us to the brink of very poor decision-making and bias. With so much information to process each day, it's quite natural that we rely on stereotypes or groupings as shortcuts to help us make faster decisions. For example, while search firms are not given tall as a criteria for hiring a company's CEO, and less than 15% of American men are over 6 feet, by the way, almost 60% of male corporate CEOs are over 6 feet. Similar patterns are true for generals and admirals and even for U.S. presidents. And I'm just using this as an example when we're talking about a height bias. And of course, I'm certainly not saying that all men are in CEO positions. We have lots of incredibly amazing women in CEO positions, but this particular example that I found very, very fascinating. The challenges to change a culture that promotes bias can be daunting. First, it takes a commitment to be aware that there are widespread assumptions, patterns, and norms that exert enormous influence over our decisions, choices, and behaviors. These can perpetuate the status quo, keep old stereotypes alive, and be an obstacle for individuals to change their own behavior, even people who would like to do so. I'm going to go over 10 ways to reduce bias in the workplace. Jot these down. Number 1, recognize that we're all human beings and that our brains make mistakes. Simply being aware of unconscious bias can immediately start to reduce our reliance on generalizations or stereotypes. Number 2, establish clear criteria in advance of making decisions, such as for hiring or promotion, so that the bias gets taken out of the decision-making process. Number 3, hold decision makers accountable, including yourself. Scrutinize the criteria and think through whether it is unintentionally screening out certain people for hiring or promotion. Be aware. Survey, number 4, is surveying employees confidentially to find out what is really going on in every aspect of the employment process, from pre-screening, resumes, to hiring, to promotion, to career opportunities, through compensation and engagement and development, as well as the performance management process. Number 5, train leadership and employees with an open dialogue and awareness, and encourage the initiative to go beyond the classroom to affinity groups, mentoring programs, and ongoing benchmarking against best practices. Pair training with best practices, such as joint interviews of applicants and requirements that candidate slates includes diverse prospects. Include practices to change the culture, such as micro-affirmations, including acts of opening doors to opportunities, gestures of inclusion and caring, acts of listening, giving credit to others, and fair and balanced feedbacks. Reward employees, which is number 8, who engage with affinity groups and brings out the best in the culture by strengthening diversity. Be transparent in the progress against your goals is number 9. And number 10, remind yourself frequently of the importance of recognizing bias and strive to be fair at all times. I think number 10 is very, very important. Neurological tests and exercises can uncover unconscious bias and reduce their influence. One way to reveal your own unconscious bias is by taking the implicit association test, IAT. It was created by researchers from Harvard, Virginia, and Washington universities. This measures the strength of links you make between concepts, for example, race or sexuality, and evaluations of stereotypes, such as whether those concepts are good or bad. Again, go back and take a look at this neurological test. It's called the implicit association test. If you Google it, you're going to find it real quick. Pay attention once you recognize your biases and point out the biases of those around you to those specific individuals. Of course, do it in a professional and appropriate manner. Be aware, question yourself, and learn from what you learn about yourself. In other words, be conscious. Awareness all on its own is a great starting point. I love the be conscious statement as compared to the unconscious bias that we've been talking about. Okay, off my soapbox. As we close, I want to remind you that you can always contact us at Tech People Resources for learning and development opportunities of any HR-related subject, or you can always reach out to me at Houchin Consulting for HR assistance of any kind. We are here to help. Tune in next time to HR Chalk Talk as I speak about the T in LGBTQI. Don't miss this insightful podcast and learn more on this subject. And remember, it's about respect. Your employees will thank you. Respect is an absolute must when leading others. Thanks for joining me today. Have a great week.